In the summer of 2019, David and Rebecca Thornton sent their 10-year-old daughter Lily to Camp Denali in Alaska, hoping the wilderness program would help their shy, butterfly-obsessed little girl build confidence and make friends. But on August 12th, during a supervised nature walk along a trail counselors had hiked hundreds of times, Lily vanished in broad daylight, disappearing from a meadow full of butterflies while 12 other children and 2 adults were just yards away. Search teams covered thousands of square miles. Helicopters swept the endless forest. Tracking dogs followed her scent to a stream where it simply ended. Yet no trace of the girl in the bright purple jacket was ever found. It was as if the ancient Alaskan wilderness had opened up and swallowed her whole. Days turned into months, and the Thorntons' marriage crumbled under the weight of not knowing. Suspicious fell on camp maintenance workers, mysterious photographers lurking in the woods, and a counselor whose story kept changing. By winter, the case went cold. The camp closed forever, and Lily's name joined the long list of children who had vanished without explanation in Alaska's 6 million acres of untamed forest. Then, 5 years later, a discovery no one saw coming changed everything. A mushroom hunter deep in the wilderness watched his dog dig frantically beneath a cluster of ancient pines, unearthing a faded purple jacket that every Alaskan recognized from the missing posters that still hung in stores across the state. When forensic teams carefully excavated the site, what they found beneath those pine roots defied comprehension. An underground shelter, children's drawings, carved into wooden walls, counting marks, tracking hundreds of days, and journals that revealed a truth more horrifying than anyone imagined. Lily hadn't died quickly or mercifully. She had survived for over a year in an underground prison, and for the last 5 months, she had been completely alone, her captor dead beside her while she slowly starved, still writing messages to her parents, still drawing butterflies, still being brave. This is the heartbreaking story of Lily Thornton, the 10-year-old who vanished in Alaska's wilderness, and the discovery 5 years later that revealed she had been closer than anyone imagined, fighting to survive in darkness while search teams passed within a quarter-mile of her prison. Welcome to Vanished Archives, where we uncover the truth behind the disappearances that haunt us. Subscribe for more gripping stories of missing children, cold cases, and the secrets hidden beneath the surface. Vanished Archives, True Crime, Missing Child, Cold Case, Alaska Disappearance, 2019 Mystery, Camp Denali, Wilderness Vanishing, Butterfly Meadow, Underground Shelter, Mushroom Hunter Discovery, Pine Forest Secrets, Forensic Evidence, Survival Story, Robert Driscoll, Child Captivity, Shocking Revelation, Lily Thornton Case, Disturbing Truth, Vanished Archives Channel. The clock on the Emergency Dispatch Center wall in Denali Borough read 4:47 p.m. when the call came through. The voice on the other end was barely holding it together. A young woman speaking too fast, her words tumbling over each other. "We need help at Camp Denali. One of our campers is missing. She's only 10 years old. Please hurry." The dispatcher, Vernon Hayes, had been handling emergency calls in Alaska for 17 years. He'd dealt with lost hikers, bear attacks, and worse, but something in the counselor's voice made him sit up straighter. "Can you tell me your name and exactly what happened?" "My name is Ashley Brennan. I'm a counselor here. We were on our afternoon nature walk with the kids, the Spruce Trail. It's only 2 miles round trip." Lily Thornton was with us at the Butterfly Meadow. I saw her taking pictures with her disposable camera. Then when we did our count at the trail marker, she was gone. "How long ago did you notice she was missing?" "Maybe 20 minutes. We searched the immediate area first, called her name, checked if she went back to camp. She's not anywhere." "Oh God, the forest is so big." Vernon could hear other voices in the background, someone shouting Lily's name over and over. The panic was spreading. He knew that in the Alaskan wilderness, 20 minutes could mean the difference between a child wandering a few hundred yards and being completely lost in millions of acres of forest. "Ashley, I need you to stay calm. I'm dispatching search and rescue right now." What was Lily wearing? A purple jacket, the bright one with reflective strips. Jeans and pink hiking boots. She had her small backpack, the one with unicorns on it. She's small for her age, about 4 feet tall, brown hair and braids. Vernon was already typing the description into the system while coordinating with Alaska State Troopers and local search and rescue volunteers. Within minutes, the first teams would be mobilizing, but he knew the statistics. The Denali wilderness covered 6 million acres. The temperature would drop to near freezing once the sun set, which in August meant they had maybe 4 hours of good daylight left. Camp Denali sat 40 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense spruce forests that stretched endlessly in every direction. The camp had been operating for 30 years, hosting 2-week wilderness programs for children aged 8 to 14. It prided itself on teaching outdoor skills and building confidence. In all those years, they'd never lost a child. By 5:15 p.m., the first search teams arrived, the parking area filled with pickup trucks, ATVs, and the steady thump of helicopters overhead. Volunteers spread out in organized grid patterns, while K-9 units worked the trail where Lily was last seen. They called her name until their voices went hoarse, the sound echoing through the trees and dying in the vast emptiness beyond. As darkness crept across the forest, portable lights blazed to life, and the search intensified. But somewhere in those endless woods, 10-year-old Lily Thornton had vanished without a trace, beginning a mystery that would haunt Alaska for the next 5 years. Lily Thornton had always been small for her age, but what she lacked in size, she made up for in curiosity. At 10 years old, she barely reached 4 feet tall, which meant she had to stand on tiptoes to reach the kitchen counter at their Anchorage home. Her mother, Rebecca, often joked that Lily could fit into spaces other kids couldn't, like the reading nook behind the living room couch, where she'd built a fort out of pillows and blankets, spending entire afternoons lost in books about faraway places and magical creatures. David Thornton worked as a petroleum engineer for the Alaska pipeline, a job that kept him away from home for weeks at a time. When he was home, he made every moment count, teaching Lily how to identify different bird calls and showing her the constellations through the telescope he'd bought for her 9th birthday. Rebecca worked 12-hour shifts as a nurse at Providence Hospital, often coming home exhausted but always finding energy to help Lily with her homework, or listen to her elaborate stories about the adventures of the characters she'd invented. Lily attended Mountain View Elementary, where her teachers described her as exceptionally bright but painfully shy. She struggled to make friends, preferring to spend recess drawing in her sketchbook or reading under the big oak tree near the playground fence. Her 4th-grade teacher, Mrs. Peterson, had suggested the summer camp to Lily's parents during their spring conference. "She needs to build confidence," Mrs. Peterson had said. "Camp Denali has an excellent program for helping quiet kids come out of their shells." The decision to send Lily to camp hadn't been easy. She'd never been away from home for more than a single sleepover at her grandmother's house. For weeks before camp, Lily had alternated between excitement and terror. She'd packed and repacked her suitcase dozens of times, carefully folding her favorite purple jacket, the one her father had bought her at the Anchorage outdoor equipment store. It had reflective strips that made her feel like an astronaut, she said, and deep pockets perfect for collecting interesting rocks and leaves. The morning of August 1st, when David and Rebecca drove Lily to the camp bus pickup location, she'd clutched her unicorn backpack so tightly her knuckles turned white. But she'd also been buzzing with nervous energy, talking nonstop about all the things she wanted to see in the forest. Bears from a safe distance, she'd specified, making her parents laugh. Maybe a moose or an eagle. And butterflies, definitely butterflies. She'd been studying Alaska butterflies in her field guide all summer. Rebecca had braided Lily's long brown hair that morning, weaving in the small blue ribbons Lily had picked out specially for camp. As they waited for the bus, David knelt down to Lily's eye level and reminded her of their family motto: "Be brave, be kind, be curious." Lily had nodded solemnly and repeated it back to him. The last photo Rebecca took showed Lily climbing onto the camp bus, turning back to wave, her face split by a nervous but genuine smile. She looked so small among the other children, her purple jacket bright against the gray morning, her unicorn backpack bouncing as she found a window seat. Neither parent could have imagined it would be the last time they'd see their daughter smile. The afternoon nature walk was supposed to be the highlight of the second week at Camp Denali. Ashley Brennan had been leading these walks for 3 summers, and she knew the spruce trail like the back of her hand. 2 miles round trip, mostly flat terrain with a few gentle hills. Perfect for children. The trail wound through dense forest before opening into a meadow where butterflies gathered in the afternoon sun, then looped back to camp along a crystal-clear stream. At 2:30 p.m. on August 12th, Ashley and her co-counselor, Marcus Rivera, gathered 12 children near the camp's main lodge. The kids were excited, chattering about what animals they might see, comparing the items they'd packed in their day bags. Lily Thornton stood slightly apart from the group, her disposable camera hanging around her neck, the purple jacket tied around her waist despite the warm afternoon. The temperature was perfect, about 68 degrees with a light breeze that kept the mosquitoes away. Ashley did her first head count at the trailhead. 12 children, all present. She always counted 3 times, a habit drilled into her during counselor training. Marcus took the lead position while Ashley stayed at the back, making sure no one fell behind. The group moved slowly, stopping frequently as Marcus pointed out different plants and birds. Lily seemed more engaged than usual, moving closer to the front of the group, raising her hand to ask questions about the different types of moss growing on the trees. 40 minutes into the hike, they reached the butterfly meadow. It was exactly as beautiful as Ashley had promised, with dozens of butterflies dancing among the wildflowers. The kids spread out slightly, though Ashley and Marcus kept them within a designated area about the size of a basketball court. This was the moment Ashley would replay in her mind thousands of times in the coming years. She saw Lily crouching near a fallen log, trying to photograph a particularly large butterfly with orange and black wings. The child's face was lit up with pure joy, the kind of expression that reminded Ashley why she loved this job. Marcus called out that they'd take a 5-minute break for water and snacks. The kids gathered in small groups, sharing trail mix and comparing what they'd seen. Ashley noticed Lily had moved toward the edge of the meadow, still following that butterfly with her camera. She was maybe 30 feet away, clearly visible in her white t-shirt and jeans. Ashley turned to help a younger boy who'd spilled his water bottle, a distraction that lasted perhaps 90 seconds. When she looked back, Lily was gone. At first, Ashley wasn't concerned. The child had probably just stepped behind one of the larger spruce trees, trying to get a better photo angle. She called out casually, "Lily, time to gather up." When there was no response, she walked to where she'd last seen the girl. The butterfly was still there, perched on a flower, but Lily had vanished. The next few minutes unfolded in slow motion. Ashley's calls became more urgent. Marcus jogged the perimeter of the meadow. The other children started calling Lily's name. They checked behind every tree, every bush, every fallen log. The meadow that had seemed so small and contained suddenly felt vast and full of hiding places. 7 minutes had passed since anyone had definitely seen Lily Thornton, and the Alaska wilderness had swallowed her whole. The search for Lily Thornton began with controlled urgency that quickly spiraled into desperate chaos. By 6 p.m., on August 12th, less than 2 hours after she'd vanished, the butterfly meadow had transformed into a command center. Pop-up tents appeared between the trees, tables covered with maps spread across the forest floor, and the constant crackle of radios filled the air where children's laughter had been just hours before. David and Rebecca Thornton arrived at 8:47 p.m., having driven the 300 miles from Anchorage at dangerous speeds. Rebecca collapsed when she saw the search teams, her legs simply giving out beneath her. David caught her, his own face a mask of barely controlled terror. They'd been at work when the call came, Rebecca in the middle of treating a patient, David reviewing pipeline pressure readings. Now they stood at the edge of an endless forest that had swallowed their daughter. The Alaska State Troopers had taken over coordination of the search. Lieutenant Michael Cassidy, a 20-year veteran of wilderness rescues, established a grid pattern extending outward from the butterfly meadow. 200 volunteers had answered the call, arriving in trucks and SUVs, many bringing their own ATVs and supplies. The local helicopter tour company donated 3 aircraft that swept back and forth above the tree canopy, their spotlights turning night into day in moving circles that reminded Rebecca of alien movies Lily loved to watch. The K-9 units arrived at midnight, 3 German shepherds trained specifically for tracking in wilderness terrain. Ashley Brennan, still in her camp counselor uniform, now muddy and torn from searching, gave them Lily's pillowcase from her bunk bed. The dogs immediately picked up a scent trail leading north from the meadow, their handlers struggling to keep pace through the thick underbrush. For 40 minutes, hope soared as the dogs followed what seemed to be a clear path. Then, at a small stream about a mile from the meadow, the trail went cold. The dogs circled frantically, whining in frustration, unable to pick up the scent on the other side of the water. Dawn brought no relief. The search area expanded to cover 20 square miles, with volunteers walking arms length apart through dense forest, calling Lily's name until their voices cracked. The weather had held through the night, temperatures only dropping to 45 degrees, survivable for a child in a purple jacket. But Alaska weather was unpredictable, and storm clouds gathered on the horizon. At 2:15 p.m. on August 13th, 24 hours after Lily's disappearance, a volunteer named James Wright found something. 2 miles northeast of the butterfly meadow, caught on a branch at child's height, was Lily's unicorn backpack. Inside were her water bottle, still half full, a bag of trail mix unopened, and her field guide to Alaska butterflies. But the discovery raised more questions than answers. The backpack was found in the opposite direction from where the dogs had tracked her scent. Either Lily had doubled back, or someone had moved the backpack. Lieutenant Cassidy called David and Rebecca to the command tent to view the backpack. Rebecca held it against her chest, breathing in her daughter's scent, while David studied the map with hollow eyes. 48 hours was approaching, the critical window when statistics for finding missing children alive dropped dramatically, and Lily Thornton was still nowhere to be found. Detective Sarah Kowalski arrived at Camp Denali on August 14th, driving her unmarked Crown Victoria over rough forest roads that had her questioning whether the car would make it. At 52 years old, with 20 years of experience in missing persons cases, she'd been specifically requested by the Alaska State Troopers. Her reputation for finding lost children, alive or dead, was unmatched in the state. She had a way of seeing what others missed, of understanding patterns that seemed random to everyone else. Kowalski's first stop wasn't the command center or the butterfly meadow. Instead, she had Ashley Brennan take her to Lily's bunk in the camp dormitory. The bed was still unmade from when Lily had gotten up 3 days earlier, her stuffed rabbit tucked under the pillow. Kowalski studied the space carefully, noting the books stacked neatly on the shelf, the drawings taped to the wall, all butterflies and forests and smiling stick figures that presumably represented Lily's family. Next, she walked the spruce trail alone, refusing the offered accompaniment of uniformed officers. She needed to see it as Lily might have seen it, without the distraction of other voices. At the butterfly meadow, she stood where Ashley said Lily had been photographing the butterfly. The sight lines were clear in every direction. For a child to disappear in the 90 seconds Ashley had been distracted seemed almost impossible unless the child had been running, or unless someone had taken her. Back at the command center, Kowalski reviewed every interview conducted so far. The other children on the nature walk had been questioned gently, their parents present. Most remembered seeing Lily with her camera, but nothing unusual. One boy mentioned hearing a whistle, like someone calling a dog, but couldn't remember exactly when. Another girl said Lily had been talking about wanting to photograph a blue butterfly she'd read about in her guide, one that was very rare. The counselor Marcus Rivera's statement interested Kowalski most. He mentioned that during the morning activities, he'd noticed a man in hiking gear on the trail near camp. Not unusual, except the man had been carrying professional camera equipment. When Marcus had waved, the man had quickly walked away. Rivera hadn't thought much of it, as photographers often came to the area for wildlife shots, but now he wondered if it meant something. Kowalski ordered a search of the camp's visitor logs and discovered something troubling. Over the past 2 weeks, 3 different volunteers had signed up to help with camp maintenance, but only 2 could be accounted for by the camp director. The third name, Robert Carson, had no matching identification in any database. His volunteer application listed an Anchorage address that turned out to be a vacant lot. The detective also examined the location where Lily's backpack was found. The ground showed no child-sized footprints, despite the soft earth that should have captured them. But there were larger boot prints, size 11 or 12, with a distinctive wear pattern on the heel. Someone had been there, someone adult-sized, and they'd been careful to disturb as little as possible. As the sun set on day 3 of the search, Kowalski sat with David and Rebecca Thornton in the camp's dining hall. She didn't offer false hope or empty promises. Instead, she told them what her experience had taught her. This wasn't a case of a child getting lost. Someone had taken Lily, and that someone had been watching, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Detective Kowalski's investigation into Camp Denali's background revealed cracks in the wilderness program's carefully maintained reputation. On her 4th day at the camp, while reviewing administrative files in Director Harold Morrison's office, she discovered a folder hidden behind others in a locked filing cabinet. The label read, "Incident Reports, 2017," and what she found inside changed the entire direction of the investigation. On July 18, 2017, a 9-year-old boy named Timothy Reeves had gone missing during an evening campfire activity. The report, written in Morrison's careful handwriting, described how Timothy had asked to use the bathroom and never returned. The counselors had searched for 6 hours before finding him near an old maintenance shed, a quarter mile from camp. The boy was disoriented, couldn't explain where he'd been, and had scratches on his arms that he said he didn't remember getting. What troubled Kowalski most was what wasn't in the file. There was no police report, no medical examination record, no follow-up documentation. When she confronted Morrison in his office, the 60-year-old director's hands shook as he poured himself coffee from a thermos that Kowalski suspected contained something stronger than caffeine. Morrison admitted he'd convinced Timothy's parents not to involve authorities. The boy was found safe, just scared and confused, probably got turned around in the dark. Bad publicity would have killed the camp, and these kids need what we offer here. The parents had agreed, especially after Morrison offered them a full refund and free enrollment for the following summer, which they'd declined. Kowalski pressed harder, and more troubling details emerged. In 2016, 2 girls had reported seeing someone watching them shower from the woods. Morrison had dismissed it as imagination. In 2018, supplies had gone missing from locked storage areas, including blankets, food, and camping equipment. Morrison blamed it on bears, even though the locks showed no damage. Each incident had been handled internally, kept quiet to protect the camp's reputation and Morrison's retirement investment. The detective ordered a complete audit of all camp employees from the past 5 years. The results were alarming. Background checks had been perfunctory at best, with several seasonal workers hired without proper screening. Marcus Webb, the maintenance worker who'd already been questioned, had been hired despite a gap in his employment history that Morrison hadn't bothered to verify. 3 other employees had criminal records for minor offenses that should have disqualified them from working with children. Ashley Brennan, when questioned again, broke down and revealed her own concerns. She'd noticed things over the summer that seemed off. Tools moved from where they'd been left, food missing from the kitchen, strange sounds in the woods at night that didn't sound like animals. She'd reported these to Morrison, who'd told her she was being paranoid, that city kids always got spooked in the wilderness. The news about Timothy Reeves changed everything for Kowalski. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. Someone had been watching Camp Denali for years, learning its routines, possibly attempting an abduction before. The 2017 incident might have been a failed attempt or a practice run. Whoever took Lily had been patient, waiting for the perfect moment when they could take a child who was small enough to carry, isolated enough to grab quickly, and whose disappearance would initially be blamed on the vast, unforgiving wilderness rather than human predation. Marcus Webb sat in the interrogation room at the Denali Borough Police Station, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. At 34 years old, he looked older, with deep lines around his eyes and premature gray threading through his dark hair. He'd been the camp's maintenance worker for 2 seasons, keeping to himself mostly, living in a small cabin on the camp property that came with the job. Detective Kowalski watched him through the one-way mirror before entering. Webb had been nervous during the initial search, sweating despite the cool weather, constantly checking his phone, and disappearing for long stretches when volunteers were being organized. He'd been seen washing his truck at an unusual hour the night Lily disappeared, and couldn't explain why he'd felt the need to clean it at midnight. The interview started with simple questions about Webb's background. He'd grown up in Washington State, moved to Alaska 5 years ago after a difficult divorce. The gap in his employment history that Morrison hadn't checked turned out to be 18 months in a psychiatric facility following a breakdown. Webb admitted this reluctantly, his voice barely above a whisper. He'd been accused by his ex-wife of inappropriate behavior with their daughter, though charges were never filed. The accusation alone had destroyed his life, cost him everything. Kowalski pressed about his whereabouts when Lily disappeared. Webb claimed he'd been in town, at Murphy's hardware store buying supplies for a broken water pump. He produced a receipt, time-stamped at 3:47 p.m., roughly an hour after Lily vanished. The drive from camp to town took 45 minutes on a good day, 30 if you pushed it. The timeline was tight but possible. The hardware store had security cameras, and Kowalski had already pulled the footage. Webb appeared on camera at 3:45 p.m., looking hurried and disheveled. He'd bought PVC pipe, duct tape, and a new shovel, paying cash. The clerk, interviewed separately, remembered Webb seemed agitated, kept checking his watch, and had mud on his boots despite it not having rained in days. More disturbing was what Kowalski found when she searched Webb's cabin with a warrant. Hidden under loose floorboards were dozens of photographs, all of children at the camp, taken with a telephoto lens. Many were innocent enough, kids playing soccer or roasting marshmallows, but others showed children in private moments, changing in their bunks or swimming in the lake. None were explicitly illegal, but they painted a picture of someone obsessed with watching children. Webb's explanation was rambling and desperate. He said he was trying to create a photo documentary about childhood innocence, that it was art, not something sick. He admitted to being in the woods near the butterfly meadow earlier that day, before the nature walk, scouting for good photography spots. He'd seen Lily there in the morning, practicing with her own camera, trying to capture a squirrel. But then Webb provided a detail that changed everything. While he was in the woods that morning, he'd seen another man, someone he didn't recognize, watching the camp from a ridge above the butterfly meadow. The man had binoculars and a notebook, and when he noticed Webb watching him, he'd quickly disappeared into the forest. Webb hadn't reported it because he wasn't supposed to be there himself, wasn't supposed to be taking pictures. The polygraph test was inconclusive, Webb's baseline anxiety making it impossible to determine if he was lying. But his alibi held up under scrutiny, the hardware store footage and receipt providing a narrow window of innocence that seemed to clear him of directly taking Lily, though not of potentially being involved in some other way. Tommy Martinez hadn't slept well since Lily disappeared. The 11-year-old boy had been her only real friend at camp, the only one who didn't think she was weird for spending lunch reading about butterflies instead of playing capture the flag. They'd sat together during meals, trading observations about the birds they'd seen, planning which trails they wanted to explore. Now, 5 days after she vanished, Tommy finally told his mother something he'd been too scared to share with the police. Detective Kowalski met with Tommy and his mother at the camp's dining hall, away from the chaos of the command center. Mrs. Martinez, who'd driven up from Fairbanks, held her son's hand as he struggled to find the words. Tommy was small for his age, with thick glasses that he kept pushing up his nose, a nervous habit that intensified as he began to speak. The morning of the nature walk, Tommy said. He and Lily had gone to the meadow early, before breakfast. It wasn't allowed, but Lily wanted to see the butterflies when the dew was still on the grass. She said they'd be different in the morning light, their wings sparkling like jewels. They'd snuck out through the back door of the dining hall, careful not to let the screen door slam. At the meadow, they'd been lying on their stomachs in the grass, watching a caterpillar climb a stem, when Tommy noticed him. A man standing at the tree line, maybe 50 yards away, holding a camera with a huge lens. Not unusual in itself, as photographers often came to capture the wilderness, but this man wasn't photographing the landscape or wildlife. His camera was pointed directly at them. Tommy had nudged Lily, but when they looked again, the man had moved deeper into the shadows. They could still see him, though, a dark shape against the trees. Lily had waved, the way her mother taught her to always be friendly, but the man didn't wave back. He just kept watching through his camera. After a few minutes, the kids got spooked and ran back to camp, making it just in time for breakfast. The man wasn't anyone from camp. Tommy was sure of that. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing dark green hiking clothes that made him blend into the forest. He had a beard, not long but not stubble either, and wore a baseball cap pulled low. Tommy remembered thinking the man's backpack looked heavy, like he was carrying a lot of equipment. Kowalski showed Tommy photographs of every male employee and volunteer at the camp, including Marcus Webb. Tommy shook his head at each one. She showed him photos of registered sex offenders from the area, but none matched. The boy was frustrated, pushing his glasses up repeatedly, trying to remember more details. Then he said something that made Kowalski's blood run cold. The man had a scar, Tommy remembered suddenly. When he'd shifted his position, his sleeve had ridden up, and Tommy saw a long white scar on his left forearm, like from a burn or maybe a knife. And his boots. They weren't regular hiking boots. They were military style, the kind Tommy's uncle wore, with deep treads and metal eyelets. But the detail that haunted Kowalski most was what Tommy said at the end. The man had been there before. Tommy had seen him 3 days earlier, at the lake during swimming time, and once near the archery range. Always watching through his camera, always focusing on the children, especially the girls who were alone. And every time, he seemed particularly interested in Lily, following her movements with his lens like a hunter tracking prey. 3 weeks had passed since Lily Thornton vanished into the Alaskan wilderness, and the massive search effort had gradually dwindled to a handful of dedicated volunteers and law enforcement officers. The command center, that had buzzed with hundreds of people, now consisted of 2 tents and a trailer, where Detective Kowalski maintained her investigation board, covered with maps, timelines, and photographs that told the story of a little girl who had simply disappeared. The weather had turned cruel, September bringing early frost and rain that washed away any remaining physical evidence. Search teams had covered over 2,000 square miles of wilderness, using every available resource. Drones with thermal imaging had flown grid patterns until their batteries died. Cave systems had been explored by spelunking experts. Every abandoned cabin, hunting blind, and natural shelter within a 50-mile radius had been checked and rechecked. David and Rebecca Thornton had set up temporary residence at the Denali Lodge, the closest accommodation to Camp Denali. They'd taken leave from their jobs, spending their savings on private search teams and psychics who claimed they could find Lily through visions. David had lost 20 pounds, his face gaunt and stubbled, spending 18-hour days in the forest, calling his daughter's name until his voice was gone. Rebecca had created her own command center in their hotel room, the walls covered with maps marked in different colored pens, each color representing a different search team's coverage area. The media attention that had been intense in the first week was fading. News vans that had lined the camp's access road were gone, moved on to fresher tragedies. The Facebook page Rebecca had created, Find Lily Thornton, still received messages of support, but the shares and comments were decreasing daily. The world was moving on, even if Lily's parents couldn't. Detective Kowalski refused to give up, but she was running out of leads. The mysterious photographer that Tommy Martinez had described had never been found, despite extensive investigation. The FBI had analyzed the photographs found in Marcus Webb's cabin using facial recognition software on the background figures, but found no unknown individuals who appeared suspicious. Webb himself had been released but remained under surveillance, his every movement tracked by officers who were convinced he knew more than he was telling. False sightings poured in from across Alaska and beyond. A girl matching Lily's description seen at a gas station in Wasilla, another at a McDonald's in Juneau, even one from Seattle. Each lead was investigated. Each one led nowhere. The purple jacket that should have made her easy to spot had become a curse, with every child in similar clothing triggering desperate phone calls from well-meaning citizens. On September 3rd, Kowalski received a call that briefly reignited hope. A bush pilot named Frank Towers reported seeing what looked like a child's drawing carved into a tree near a remote lake, 60 miles north of where Lily disappeared. The carving appeared fresh, showing a butterfly and what might have been the letter L. A team was dispatched immediately, but the carving turned out to be months old, left by other campers earlier in the summer. The camp had closed for the season, the other children sent home with counselors trained in trauma response. Harold Morrison had announced the camp would not reopen the following summer, maybe not ever. The butterfly meadow where Lily had last been seen had become an unofficial memorial, with people leaving purple ribbons tied to tree branches, teddy bears, and photographs of butterflies, all slowly being claimed by the wilderness that had taken her. Rebecca Thornton stood in the middle of the Denali Lodge hotel room at 3 a.m., staring at the wall of maps she'd created. Red pins marked confirmed search areas. Blue pins showed unconfirmed sightings. Yellow pins indicated places Lily had mentioned wanting to see someday. The wall looked like a desperate rainbow, each color representing another failed attempt to find her daughter. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours straight in 25 days. David sat on the edge of the bed, watching his wife trace the same route with her finger for the 100th time. She was convinced everyone had missed something, some obvious clue that would lead them to Lily. Her hair, once carefully styled for her nursing shifts, hung limp and unwashed. She'd been wearing the same sweatshirt for 4 days, the one Lily had given her for Mother's Day with "World's Best Mom" printed across the front. The breaking point came when David suggested they return to Anchorage for a few days. Rebecca's reaction was explosive, throwing a coffee mug against the wall, screaming that he was giving up on their daughter. How could he even think about leaving when Lily was out there, scared, waiting for them to find her? David tried to hold her, but she fought him off, her fists beating against his chest until she collapsed, sobbing on the floor. Rebecca had quit her job via email, unable to imagine returning to care for other people's children when she couldn't find her own. She'd maxed out 3 credit cards buying survival equipment, convinced that if she just had the right gear, she could search areas the official teams had missed. Her sister Caroline had driven up from Oregon, trying to convince Rebecca to take care of herself, to eat something besides energy bars, to shower, to sleep. Rebecca had locked her out of the hotel room. The command center she'd created was meticulous and chaotic simultaneously. Spreadsheets tracking every person who'd been at the camp, their backgrounds researched through social media and public records. She'd identified 17 people she considered suspicious, including a janitor who'd been fired 3 years ago and a parent who'd complained about camp policies. Detective Kowalski had investigated each one, finding nothing connecting them to Lily's disappearance, but Rebecca wasn't satisfied. She'd started walking the forest alone at night, against everyone's advice. She carried Lily's favorite stuffed rabbit, the one from her bunk bed, believing somehow her daughter would smell it, hear her calling, and come home. David had followed her once, watching from a distance as she stumbled through the darkness, calling Lily's name until her voice was raw, begging the forest to give her baby back. The hotel staff had grown accustomed to Rebecca's presence in the lobby at strange hours, printing missing person flyers on their business center printer, making calls to psychics and search organizations across the country. She'd spent $8,000 on a team that claimed their dogs could track scents months old, only to watch them find nothing but deer trails. Another $5,000 went to a man who said he could communicate with missing children through dreams, who told her Lily was near water, which in Alaska narrowed it down to everywhere. David tried to be strong, but watching his wife disappear into obsession while their daughter remained missing was destroying him too. Their marriage, once solid, was fracturing under the weight of blame and guilt that neither would speak aloud, but both felt crushing them. Every moment Lily remained gone. The first snow fell on October 15th, covering the Alaskan wilderness in a white blanket that felt like a burial shroud to Rebecca Thornton. 2 months had passed since Lily disappeared, and winter's arrival meant the end of any realistic ground searches. The forest that had swallowed her daughter was now frozen and impassable, locked beneath ice and snow that wouldn't melt until spring. Detective Kowalski had returned to Anchorage but kept the case active, working it from her desk when she wasn't handling new missing persons reports. The case file had grown to 3 boxes, filled with interview transcripts, photographs, and dead-end leads. She'd started corresponding with a retired FBI profiler named William Garrett, who'd volunteered to review the case after seeing it featured on a national crime program. Garrett was 71, had worked over 200 child abduction cases during his 30-year career with the Bureau. From his home in Virginia, he studied every piece of evidence Kowalski sent him, building a profile not just of the person who took Lily, but of the kind of place he would have taken her to. His analysis was methodical, treating each detail as a piece of a larger puzzle that others had been looking at from the wrong angle. The profiler's first observation challenged the prevailing theory. Everyone assumed Lily had been taken far from the camp, but Garrett believed she'd never left a 5-mile radius. Predators who operate in wilderness areas are territorial, he explained in one of his lengthy emails to Kowalski. They know their hunting ground intimately. Every cave, every hidden spot, every abandoned structure. Moving a victim long distances increases risk. This person had a prepared location nearby. Garrett identified the perpetrator as someone with extensive wilderness survival skills, likely military or forestry service background. The man was between 35 and 50, physically strong enough to carry a small child over rough terrain, and had been watching the camp for weeks, or possibly years. He wasn't a drifter or opportunist, but someone with deep roots in the area, possibly someone who'd been overlooked because they seemed to belong there. The photographer Tommy Martinez had seen became Garrett's focus. The military-style boots, the methodical surveillance, the heavy backpack that might have contained supplies for an extended stay in the wilderness. This was someone who'd prepared for this specific abduction, who'd studied Lily's patterns and chosen her deliberately. The scar on his arm suggested a past trauma, possibly combat-related, or from wilderness work. David Thornton had moved back to Anchorage in November, returning to work partly for the income they desperately needed and partly to escape the suffocating grief of the hotel room. Rebecca had stayed at the lodge until the owner gently informed her they needed the room for incoming guests. She'd rented a cabin 5 miles from Camp Denali, insisting on being close when the spring thaw came and searches could resume. The marriage that had been strained finally shattered with a phone call on December 1st. David had filed for separation, not divorce, but a legal acknowledgement that they couldn't continue as they were. Rebecca had listened to his explanation in silence, then hung up and walked into the snow-covered forest, where she screamed until her throat bled. The sound echoed off the mountains, primal and raw, the cry of a mother whose child had been stolen by both a predator and the pitiless wilderness. Winter in Alaska is long and dark, and in that darkness, hope becomes harder to maintain. But Garrett kept working, convinced that when spring came, he would know where to look for Lily Thornton. The anonymous letter arrived at the Denali Borough Police Department on April 3, 2020, just as the last of the winter snow was melting from the lower elevations. Detective Kowalski had been reviewing Lily's case file when the desk sergeant brought her the envelope, no return address, postmarked from Fairbanks. Inside was a single sheet of paper with text created from cut-out magazine letters, like something from an old movie, and a Polaroid photograph that made Kowalski's hands shake. The photograph showed Lily's purple jacket, laid carefully on what appeared to be a wooden floor. The jacket was clean, not weather-damaged as it should have been after 8 months in the wilderness. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was part of what looked like a metal chain. The message created from magazine letters read, "She lasted longer than you think. Copper Creek. The old Jameson place. You were so close." Kowalski immediately called in the FBI's forensics team from Anchorage. The photograph was genuine, not digitally manipulated, likely taken with an actual vintage Polaroid camera. The paper showed no fingerprints except for postal workers, but the selection of magazines used for the letters was telling, all from hunting and survival publications sold at only 3 stores in the Fairbanks area. Security footage from those stores was long gone, 8 months old and recorded over dozens of times. Copper Creek was 40 miles north of where Lily had disappeared, accessible only by rough forestry roads that were impassable most of the year. The Jameson place referred to an abandoned trapper's cabin that had been built in the 1960s by Ernest Jameson, a recluse who died in 1998. The property had been tied up in legal disputes between distant relatives ever since, sitting empty and slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The search team assembled at dawn on April 5th included Kowalski, FBI agents, wilderness search specialists, and a forensic team. The road to Copper Creek had to be cleared by bulldozer in several places where spring runoff had washed out sections. It took 6 hours to cover the 40 miles, the convoy moving slowly through mud and debris. Rebecca Thornton had demanded to come, but Kowalski had refused, not knowing what they might find. The cabin appeared abandoned from the outside, its roof partially collapsed, windows broken. But as they approached, Kowalski noticed details that didn't fit: fresh scratches on the door frame at lock height, boot prints in the mud that the recent rain hadn't completely washed away, a path worn through the undergrowth leading to the cabin's root cellar entrance, partially hidden by deliberately placed branches. Inside the cabin itself, they found nothing initially: dust, animal droppings, and decay. But the root cellar told a different story. The wooden door had been reinforced with steel brackets, new within the past year. The lock was modern, heavy-duty, recently oiled. Bolt cutters made quick work of it, and what they found below changed everything they thought they knew about Lily's disappearance. The cellar had been converted into a prison. A small cot with restraint points drilled into the frame, empty food cans stacked neatly in a corner, all with dates from the previous fall. A bucket that had served as a toilet, and carved into the wooden support beam, in a child's shaky handwriting, Lily Thornton was here, still brave. But Lily herself was gone, and the cellar had been abandoned for months based on the dust and spider webs. Whoever had held her here had moved her, either because they knew searches would resume in spring, or because something had forced them to relocate. The question that haunted everyone was whether Lily had been alive when she was moved. The investigation into the Jameson cabin revealed a name that sent chills through Detective Kowalski's spine: Robert Driscoll. The property records showed that while the cabin was tied up in legal disputes, someone named R. Driscoll had filed paperwork claiming squatters' rights in 2018, though the claim had never been formally processed. The bureaucratic oversight had allowed him to use the property without anyone noticing or caring about an old trapper's cabin in the middle of nowhere. Robert Driscoll was 53 years old, a former wildlife photographer who'd worked for several nature magazines before abruptly leaving the profession in 2015. His employment history showed he'd been a photographer for Alaska Wildlife Magazine, National Forest Quarterly, and several smaller publications. Co-workers remembered him as talented but strange, obsessed with capturing what he called pure moments of innocence in nature. He'd been fired from his last job after complaints that he'd been photographing park visitors without permission, particularly children. His background was even more troubling. Driscoll had served in the Army from 1986 to 1994 as a reconnaissance specialist, trained in survival, evasion, and tracking. After his discharge, he'd worked for the Forest Service for 10 years before turning to photography. He'd never married, had no children, and lived alone in a series of remote cabins throughout Alaska. The scar Tommy Martinez had described matched one Driscoll had received during a training accident at Fort Richardson. Financial records showed Driscoll had inherited money from an uncle in 2017, enough to live on without working. He'd purchased supplies in bulk from various stores across Alaska, always paying cash, always careful to spread his purchases around, so no single store would notice the pattern. Camping equipment, non-perishable food, chains, locks, and notably, children's books and toys, all bought by a man who had no children. The FBI tracked Driscoll's movements through credit card records from before he'd switched to cash. He'd been at Camp Denali in 2017, the same time Timothy Reeves had gone missing for 6 hours. He'd been registered as a volunteer photographer, offering to document the camp's activities for their website. Harold Morrison hadn't remembered him specifically, but the paperwork was there, including a background check that had somehow come back clean despite his firing from the magazine job. Kowalski discovered Driscoll had been renting storage units across Alaska, paying years in advance. When they obtained warrants and opened them, they found disturbing collections. Thousands of photographs of children taken at parks, campgrounds, and public events throughout Alaska. Most were taken with telephoto lenses, the subjects unaware they were being photographed. Lily Thornton appeared in dozens of photos from the weeks before her abduction, including some taken at locations her parents didn't know she'd visited. One storage unit contained what Driscoll apparently considered his portfolio: leather-bound albums with photographs meticulously labeled with dates and locations. The progression showed his obsession evolving from wildlife to children over the course of years. Notes in the margins revealed his twisted philosophy, that children were the last pure beings in a corrupted world, that he was documenting their innocence before society destroyed it. The most chilling discovery was a journal entry dated August 1, 2019, 11 days before Lily disappeared. Found the perfect subject at Denali Camp. Small, quiet, appreciates beauty like I do. She photographs butterflies with the same care I use. She understands the importance of preserving perfect moments. Soon. But Driscoll himself had vanished as thoroughly as Lily had, leaving behind only evidence of his obsessions and carefully planned crimes. The manhunt for Robert Driscoll became the largest in Alaska's history, involving state troopers, FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and Canadian authorities. His photograph was broadcast on every news channel, posted in every post office, store, and gas station from Anchorage to the Canadian border. The man who'd spent years becoming invisible in plain sight was now the most wanted person in North America. Detective Kowalski worked 18-hour days coordinating search efforts from a new command center in Fairbanks. They tracked every vehicle Driscoll had ever owned, finding 2 abandoned trucks and an old SUV, all registered under fake names. Each vehicle was processed for evidence, yielding more photographs, maps with locations circled, and receipts for supplies that painted a picture of someone who'd been planning for years to live completely off the grid. The FBI brought in their best trackers, including Nathan Yazzie, a Navajo specialist who'd found dozens of fugitives in wilderness areas. Yazzie studied Driscoll's patterns, his purchases, his known hideouts, and came to a disturbing conclusion. This man had been preparing bolt holes throughout Alaska for at least a decade. He could be anywhere within 1,000 square miles, and he knew the terrain better than anyone searching for him. They found 3 more cabins Driscoll had used, each one showing signs of hasty abandonment. At one, near Denali, they discovered children's clothing that didn't match anything Lily had been wearing, suggesting she wasn't his first victim. DNA testing would later confirm the clothes belonged to Timothy Reeves, the boy who'd gone missing for 6 hours in 2017, though thankfully he'd been released relatively unharmed. Rebecca Thornton had become a different person since learning Lily might still be alive. The desperate, chaotic energy had transformed into cold, focused determination. She hired private investigators, offering a $200,000 reward raised through donations and a second mortgage on their Anchorage home. She gave interviews to every media outlet that would listen, speaking directly to Driscoll, begging him to let Lily go, promising no revenge if he'd just return her daughter. The search teams used every available technology. Satellite imagery scanned for heat signatures in remote areas. Drones flew predetermined patterns over vast stretches of wilderness. Ground-penetrating radar searched for underground bunkers or modified cave systems. They found dozens of abandoned mines, old cabins, and natural caves, but no sign of Driscoll or Lily. By July, 3 months into the manhunt, leads were drying up. Driscoll seemed to have vanished completely, possessing wilderness skills that made him nearly impossible to track. Yazzie believed he was moving constantly, never staying in one place more than a few days, carrying Lily with him. The physical demands of such movement meant he'd need supply caches, places where he'd stored food and equipment in advance. Then came a breakthrough. A fisherman named Carl Hopkins reported seeing a man matching Driscoll's description buying supplies at a remote lodge on the Copper River, paying with cash that was wet and muddy. The man had been nervous, constantly watching the door, and had bought enough food for 2 people. When Hopkins had tried to make conversation, asking if he was camping with family, the man had grabbed his supplies and practically run from the store. The sighting was 5 days old by the time it was reported, but it gave search teams a new focus area. Driscoll was still in Alaska, still moving, and apparently still had Lily with him. The question was whether they could find him before winter returned, forcing him to hole up somewhere they'd never find him. 2 years had passed since the fisherman's sighting, and the hunt for Robert Driscoll had become a cold case that only Detective Kowalski and a small FBI task force continued to pursue actively. It was now August 2022, 3 years since Lily Thornton had vanished from the butterfly meadow. Rebecca still lived in Alaska, working as a grocery store clerk to pay for her cabin, while David had remarried and moved to Seattle, unable to bear the weight of endless hope and despair. The break came from an unexpected source. Detective Lisa Park, who'd recently joined the Anchorage Police Department, had a background in data analysis from her previous career in tech. She approached Kowalski with a pattern she'd noticed while reviewing old cases for training. Driscoll's documented movements over the years, from his photography work and Forest Service employment, showed he repeatedly returned to specific areas during salmon spawning seasons. Park had mapped every known location where Driscoll had been spotted or photographed over 20 years. The pattern was subtle but clear. He followed the salmon runs like clockwork, returning to the same remote streams and rivers where bears gathered to feed. It made sense for a wildlife photographer, but Park believed he was still following these patterns, using the predictable food source to sustain himself while staying off the grid. The spawning season was just beginning in late August, and Park identified 5 locations where Driscoll had been documented at least 3 times in previous years. All were extremely remote, accessible only by float plane or days of hiking. All had abandoned structures nearby, old fishing camps or Forest Service cabins that had been decommissioned decades ago. If Driscoll was still alive, still moving with Lily, he would need to stock up on protein for the coming winter. Kowalski assembled a small team, not wanting to spook Driscoll with a massive search presence. They would check each location quietly, using surveillance drones and long-range observation before moving in. The first 3 locations yielded nothing but mosquitoes and curious bears. The fourth, on the remote Chickaloon River, showed something different through the drone's thermal camera: 2 human heat signatures in a cabin that was supposed to be abandoned. The team waited for dawn, not wanting to risk a night approach where Driscoll's military training would give him every advantage. Through high-powered scopes, they watched the cabin for signs of movement. At 6:47 a.m., smoke began rising from the chimney. 20 minutes later, a figure emerged to collect water from the river. Even from 500 yards away, through the morning mist, they could see the distinctive scar on his left forearm. But more importantly, a few minutes after Driscoll returned to the cabin, a small figure appeared in the window, a child with long brown hair, gazing out at the forest. Kowalski's hands shook as she radioed for backup. After 3 years of searching, they'd found Lily Thornton. She was alive, but the hardest part was still ahead. They had to extract her safely from a paranoid, military-trained survivalist who'd proven capable of vanishing into the wilderness at the slightest provocation. The team spent the next 6 hours planning their approach. They couldn't risk Driscoll running with Lily again, potentially harming her if he felt cornered. They needed to separate them somehow, to get Lily away from him before he realized they were there. The salmon running in the river gave them an idea, a way to lure Driscoll out while keeping Lily safe inside. James Patterson had been hunting pine mushrooms in the Alaskan wilderness for 32 years, selling them to high-end restaurants in Anchorage and Seattle. October 2024 was shaping up to be a good season, with the perfect combination of rain and warm days that made the mushrooms flourish. His wife always worried when he went out alone, but James knew these forests better than his own backyard, and besides, he had Buck, his 7-year-old German Shepherd, for company. On October 15th, James was working a grove of ancient pines about 60 miles northeast of where Camp Denali used to be, an area so remote he had to hike 2 days from the nearest logging road to reach it. The mushrooms here were pristine, untouched by other foragers who didn't want to venture this deep into the wilderness. Buck ranged ahead, trained to sniff out the valuable fungi without disturbing them. It was Buck who found it first. The dog started barking frantically near a cluster of pines that grew so close together their roots had merged into a complex web above ground. James called him back, but Buck wouldn't come, instead digging desperately at a spot between the largest trees. This wasn't normal behavior. Buck was trained never to dig where mushrooms might be growing. As James approached, he noticed the ground looked different here. While the rest of the forest floor was covered in decades of pine needles and natural debris, this spot had been disturbed. The soil was looser, darker, and there was a slight depression, as if the ground had settled over time. Buck's digging had already exposed something that made James's stomach turn. A piece of fabric, faded and dirty but unmistakably purple. James immediately called Buck off and reached for his satellite phone. He'd heard about the Lily Thornton case like everyone in Alaska. The purple jacket had been mentioned in every news report, on every missing poster that still hung in some stores. His hands shook as he dialed 911, explaining his location through GPS coordinates, telling them what he'd found, and that he wouldn't touch anything else until authorities arrived. Detective Kowalski received the call at her desk in Anchorage. 5 years and 2 months had passed since Lily disappeared, and while the case remained technically open, even she had begun to lose hope. The report of purple fabric in such a remote location seemed significant enough to warrant immediate investigation. She assembled a recovery team that included forensic specialists and flew out in a state trooper helicopter within 2 hours. James Patterson waited by the site, having marked a trail from the nearest clearing where the helicopter could land. He'd covered the area Buck had disturbed with a tarp to protect it from rain that was starting to fall. As he sat there in the gathering gloom of the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this place held terrible secrets. The forensic team worked through the night under portable lights, carefully excavating the site layer by layer. The purple fabric was indeed from a child's jacket, the reflective strips still visible despite years underground. But there was more beneath the jacket, much more, and as they dug deeper, everyone present knew they were about to uncover the truth about what had happened to Lily Thornton. The excavation beneath the ancient pines required delicate, painstaking work. The forensic team established a grid pattern around the site, documenting every layer of soil they removed. The root system of the merged pines had grown through and around what they were uncovering, nature slowly reclaiming what had been hidden here. Detective Kowalski stood at the edge of the excavation, watching as each scoop of earth revealed more of the truth she'd been seeking for 5 years. By the morning of October 16th, they'd uncovered the full extent of the underground shelter. It wasn't just a grave, but a carefully constructed hiding place, built with salvaged lumber and sheet metal, creating a space roughly 8 feet by 6 feet and 4 feet deep. The entrance had been covered with a wooden hatch, now rotted through, which had been concealed under pine needles and forest debris. Inside, the team found evidence of prolonged habitation that made everyone present sick with the implications. The walls had been lined with tar paper for waterproofing, and wooden planks created a crude floor. In one corner was a small pile of children's books, their pages swollen with moisture but still readable, including one about butterflies that had Lily's name written carefully on the inside cover. Empty food cans were stacked neatly along one wall, their labels long gone, but the metal still intact. A bucket in the corner had served as a toilet, and scratch marks on the wooden supports showed someone had been counting days, hundreds of small lines grouped in sets of 5. But it was the drawings that broke Kowalski's composure. Carved into every available wooden surface were pictures clearly made by a child's hand. Butterflies, trees, stick figures of a family, and over again, the word home dug deep into the wood. Some drawings showed 2 figures, one small and one large, and in these, the larger figure was always depicted as a dark shadow, while the smaller one was surrounded by carefully carved hearts. In what had been the sleeping area, they found the remains. The medical examiner would later confirm it was Lily Thornton, identified through dental records and DNA comparison with samples from her parents. She'd been wrapped in a thermal sleeping bag, positioned carefully as if someone had tried to make her comfortable. Next to her was a stuffed rabbit, the same one that had been missing from her bunk at camp, and her camera, the film still inside. The forensic team also found something unexpected: another body, partially buried beneath the shelter's floor. This one was adult-sized, male, and had been there longer than Lily. The skeleton showed signs of a severe leg fracture that had never properly healed. Dental records would later confirm it was Robert Driscoll, and the forensic reconstruction would reveal he died approximately 8 months after Lily's abduction, likely from infection related to his untreated injury. The evidence told a horrific story. Driscoll had held Lily in this underground prison for months, but something had gone wrong. Maybe he'd fallen while gathering supplies, breaking his leg so badly he could barely make it back. He'd died slowly, probably in agony, while Lily remained trapped in the shelter. The counting marks on the walls suggested she'd survived him by several months, maybe as long as a year, rationing the supplies he'd stockpiled, writing messages and drawing pictures in a desperate hope someone would find her. Among the deteriorating supplies in the underground shelter, the forensic team discovered a waterproof container that had protected its contents from 5 years of Alaska weather. Inside were 3 composition notebooks, their pages filled with 2 distinct handwriting styles. The first was Robert Driscoll's tight, controlled script. The second, starting about a third of the way through the second notebook, was the careful, looping handwriting of a child who was trying very hard to be neat. Driscoll's entries began 2 weeks before Lily's abduction, detailing his final preparations. He wrote about watching her at the camp, how she reminded him of his sister who died when they were children, how he needed to save her from a world that would destroy her innocence. His delusions were complete, referring to the underground shelter as a sanctuary where he could teach her the important things: photography, wilderness, survival, and how to see beauty in nature's cruelty. The entries from the first months of Lily's captivity were disturbing in their normalcy. Driscoll documented their daily routine like a teacher's lesson plan. Morning reading time with the books he'd collected, afternoon photography lessons using her camera, evening discussions about the butterflies she loved. He seemed genuinely confused by her crying, her begging to go home, writing that she would understand in time that he'd saved her from parents who didn't appreciate her gifts. Then came the entry dated March 15th, 2020, 7 months after the abduction. Driscoll described falling while setting trap lines for rabbits, his legs snapping with a sound he compared to a branch breaking. He'd managed to crawl back to the shelter, but the bone was protruding through the skin. He'd tried to set it himself, but infection set in quickly. His handwriting became increasingly erratic as fever took hold. The final entry just a scrawled confession that he was dying, and God would forgive him for what he'd done. Lily's first entry was dated March 22nd, 2020, written in pencil so faint it was barely readable. "The bad man is dead. I tried to help him, but he got too sick. I'm scared. Mommy and Daddy, please find me. I'm in the woods where the butterflies don't come." Her entries over the following months showed remarkable courage for an 11-year-old child. She rationed the remaining food carefully, counting cans and dividing them by days. She collected rainwater through a crack in the shelter's roof. She tried repeatedly to dig her way out, but the packed earth and root system were too much for her small hands. She kept herself sane by writing letters to her parents, telling them about her days, pretending they would read them soon. By July 2020, her entries showed growing weakness. Food was running out despite her careful rationing. She wrote about feeling tired all the time, about dreams where her mother came to rescue her, but she couldn't wake up. Her last dated entry was August 3, 2020, almost exactly a year after her abduction. It read simply, "I stayed brave like Daddy said. I love you." But there was one more entry, undated, written in crayon when her pencils had worn down to nothing. The handwriting was shaky, the words running together, but the message was clear. "If someone finds this, please tell my parents I wasn't scared at the end. I saw butterflies in my dreams, purple ones like my jacket. They were beautiful." The forensic reconstruction of Lily Thornton's captivity took 3 weeks to complete, with experts from across the country contributing to piece together the full timeline of events. Every piece of evidence from the underground shelter was cataloged, analyzed, and cross-referenced with Driscoll's journal entries and Lily's heartbreaking writings. What emerged was a story of unimaginable cruelty, followed by extraordinary courage from a child who never gave up hope. The investigation revealed that Driscoll had been planning Lily's abduction for over 3 years. He'd built the underground shelter in 2016, originally intending it as a survival cache, but his obsession with children had transformed it into a prison. He'd tested it himself, spending weeks at a time underground to ensure someone could survive there long term. He'd installed ventilation pipes camouflaged as fallen branches, created a water collection system, and stockpiled enough preserved food to last 2 people 18 months. The day of the abduction had been carefully orchestrated. Driscoll had jammed the camp's radio frequencies to prevent immediate communication, used a wildlife recording to lure Lily away from the group, and carried her through streams and over rocky ground to prevent tracking dogs from following their scent. He'd hiked 17 miles through the night to reach the shelter, carrying the sedated child in a modified backpack designed for hunting expeditions. The photographs from Lily's camera, developed by the FBI lab, provided a window into her captivity. The first images were from camp, butterflies and friends and counselors smiling at activities. Then came darker images, blurry shots of the shelter's interior, Driscoll's face caught in profile while he read to her, her own feet in worn pink boots, standing on the wooden floor. The last photographs were taken after Driscoll's death, self-portraits of a girl growing thinner, still managing to smile for the camera she held at arm's length. Medical examination confirmed that Lily had survived approximately 13 months after her abduction, the last 5 months completely alone after Driscoll's death. She'd suffered from malnutrition and vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight, but there was no evidence of physical abuse beyond the imprisonment itself. Driscoll, in his twisted mind, had seen himself as her protector, not her tormentor. The excavation team found evidence of Lily's repeated escape attempts. She'd used spoons to dig at the walls, broken apart the wooden supports trying to create tools, and even attempted to burn through the roof using pages from books and matches Driscoll had stored. Each attempt had failed, the shelter too well constructed, her child's strength no match for the prison built by a military-trained survivalist. Detective Kowalski discovered something that would haunt her forever. Based on the timeline, search teams had passed within a quarter-mile of the shelter at least 4 times during the initial search period. If they'd expanded their grid just slightly further north, if the dogs hadn't lost the scent at the stream, if anyone had noticed the unusually dense clustering of pine trees that concealed the ventilation pipes, Lily might have been found alive. The truth was devastating in its simplicity. Lily Thornton had been held less than 60 miles from where she'd disappeared, had survived for over a year in conditions that would have broken most adults, and had died alone in the dark, still hoping her parents would find her, still being brave as her father had taught her. The small cemetery in Anchorage was covered in purple on October 30th, 2024, the day Lily Thornton was finally laid to rest. Purple balloons tied to every headstone, purple ribbons wrapped around trees, and hundreds of purple butterflies made from paper that local school children had folded, their wings carrying messages of love for a girl most had never met. The morning sky was clear, the kind of crisp autumn day Lily had loved, when the air smelled like pine and coming snow. Rebecca and David Thornton stood side by side for the first time in 2 years, their hands not quite touching but close enough to feel each other's presence. David's new wife stayed in the car, understanding this moment belonged to Lily's parents alone. Rebecca wore the purple jacket she'd bought to match Lily's, the one she'd worn during every search, every vigil, every desperate night in the forest, calling her daughter's name. The service was supposed to be private, but the community couldn't stay away. Camp counselor Ashley Brennan came, carrying the weight of survivor's guilt that no amount of therapy had lifted. Tommy Martinez, now 16, stood with his mother, holding a framed photograph of the butterfly Lily had been trying to capture that last day. Detective Kowalski was there in civilian clothes, her badge tucked away but her presence a reminder that someone had never stopped looking. The pastor read from Lily's own journal entries, The ones about staying brave, about seeing beauty even in darkness, about love being stronger than fear. When he read her final message about the purple butterflies in her dreams, Rebecca's knees buckled, and David caught her, holding her the way he had the night Lily was born, when they'd promised to always protect their little girl. After the formal service, Rebecca approached the microphone with a paper that shook in her hands. She spoke about the daughter who'd found magic in ordinary things, who'd named every butterfly in their garden, who'd left notes in her lunchbox saying, "Be brave, Salsas, Oni 3. Mommy, when Rebecca had difficult shifts at the hospital, she announced the creation of Lily's Law, already passed by the Alaska legislature, requiring GPS trackers for all children attending wilderness camps and mandating extensive background checks for anyone working with minors in isolated settings. David spoke next, his voice breaking as he described teaching Lily to identify constellations, promising her that wherever she was, they were looking at the same stars. He talked about her last morning, their family motto, how proud he was that she'd remembered to be brave, be kind, be curious, even in the face of unimaginable horror. He announced a scholarship fund in Lily's name for children to attend nature photography workshops, keeping alive her dream of capturing beauty in the world. As the casket was lowered into the ground, something extraordinary happened. A cloud of monarch butterflies, impossibly late in the season, impossibly far north for their species, descended on the cemetery. They landed on the flowers, on the mourner's shoulders, on Lily's casket, their orange and black wings like stained glass in the morning Sunday. The scientists would later say it was a freak weather pattern, an anomaly of wind and temperature that had blown them off course. But everyone at the cemetery that day knew better. They knew it was Lily, finally free, finally home, telling them in the only way she could that she'd found her butterflies at last.